Welcome to the Essential Substance Abuse Skills webinar series. I'm Kate Trams, and I'll be administering today's webinar. Today, Ken Winters will be speaking on the science of addiction, the brain on adolescence. This training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center, or ATTC. The National American Indian and Alaska Native ATTC is one of 4 national focus centers which serves the ATTC network. The ATTC network is a nationwide network made up of 10 regional centers, 4 national focus centers, and a network coordinating office. The map on this slide shows the locations of the 4 national focus center ATTCs. To learn more about our center, the network, or your regional center, please visit our website. This series is designed to be a broad overview to assist in preparing for written alcohol and drug certification examinations, to enhance existing knowledge, and to improve overall competence in treatment outcomes. Please be aware that this series is not meant to stand alone, and previous education and training is necessary in order to pass alcohol and drug certification exams. We recommend that if you are preparing for an exam, that you seek additional preparatory help and let this course be one of many tools you use to prepare. Our next webinar in this series is scheduled for Wednesday, February 19, where Dee LeBeau-Hein will present Referral, Service Coordination, and Documentation. In addition to this webinar series, we offer another series titled the American Indian and Alaska Native Behavioral Health Webinar Series, which presents on current topics of interest in the behavioral health field. The next session in this series will be held on February 5th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where Spiro Manson will present on Bridging the Gaps in Culture and Geography, Telehealth with American Indian Communities. For more information on our webinar series, you can contact me at the email address or phone number provided on this slide. Our center is a NADAC certified educational provider, and we'd be happy to provide you with CEHs. The cost is $10 to do so. The CEH request form is available for download in the Files pod in the webinar screen. If you choose to download a file, a new tab will be opened in your browser, and you will have to click on the webinar window to return to view the webinar. If you are unable to download the documents from the webinar, please contact me using the information on the slide. Immediately following today's webinar, you will be redirected to our GIPRA evaluation. We invite you to participate in this brief online customer survey. This survey asks about your satisfaction with the event and will take less than 10 minutes to complete. GIPRA stands for the Government Performance and Results Act, and SAMHSA asks us to evaluate our events in order to comply with this act and provide improved performance assessment and accountability. SAMHSA uses information collected by these surveys to determine how many people have attended our events, your satisfaction with our events, and how useful our events are to you. We hope you will assist us in gathering information about our services by participating in our survey. Before we start today's session, I'd like to go over a few instructions for the Adobe Connect system. To view the presentation in full screen mode, click on the full screen button at the top right corner of this presentation pod. To return to the regular view, click the button again. You will be muted for the duration of this webinar. Please use the Q&A pod to share your questions and comments. Your questions will only be visible to me and the presenter, and I will pass your questions along to the presenter at appropriate points in this presentation. There are options for providing feedback for the webinar by using the attendee menu, which is on the upper left hand of your webinar screen and is signified by a figure raising their hand. We suggest that in lieu of using the raising hand feature, participants should submit comments or questions using the Q&A pod, but please feel free to submit other feedback using these options. You will also notice that we will be opening a couple of poll questions to the right of this presentation pod, in which we would appreciate your participation. We will be showing the results of these poll questions at the end of the presentation. We would also like you to be aware that this webinar records participant attention time. If you minimize the webinar or are working in another window, the system will record you as inactive, and that may be reflected in the number of CEHs received. Today's speaker is Dr. Ken Winters. Dr. Winters is the director of the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota Medical School, and a senior scientist at the Treatment Research Institute. He has published numerous articles based on his research in the prevention and treatment of adolescent drug abuse and serves on editorial boards for a number of journals in this area, including Psychology of Addictive Behaviors and the Journal of Child and Adolescent Substance Abuse. Dr. Winters, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your expertise with us today.
Kate, thank you. Appreciate the excellent introduction. And thank you all who are joining this event. Good day to you. As you can see from the title of my talk, I am going to be taking a neuroscience view of adolescent drug abuse. Please appreciate that I'm a proponent of the biopsychosocial model of adolescent drug abuse and drug involvement. And so an important picture of understanding how youngsters get curious about drugs and develop a drug problem involves us understanding a lot more than just a neuroscience perspective. But for the next hour, I'm going to drill down on what we might learn in understanding the etiology and the prevention and treatment of drug abuse when we look at some important recent emerging sciences from the neuroscience perspective. And so I've broken down my talk into 4 components. The first 3 are the core content of the talk, and then I'll summarize at the end. And you can see from this that I'm going to be briefly overviewing 2 emerging sciences from neuroscience, the one that talks and helps us understand how drugs affect the brain, and the more recent science on brain development for young people during the teenage years. Then I'll intersect those 2 and talk about what do we know, or how can we understand adolescent risk for substances when we consider that they have a developing brain. That will focus on alcohol with a little commentary on marijuana, and then I'll summarize. The summary also brings into the mix my points of view on how the science might help prevention and treatment. A couple good books are out there if you want to do some more reading. These are written for lay people and parents, and I think teenagers might benefit from them as well. The one on the right, David Walsh's book, is excellent. Why Do They Act That Way? And the one on the left, Anthony Wolf's book, is also quite good. The full title of the book is Get Out of My Life, But First Can You Drive Me and Cheryl to the Mall? And the subtitle there, I think, is apropos. It reflects some of what we know about how teenagers process information and sometimes blurt out things with high emotion. We'll talk about parts of the brain that might be overactive in those kinds of situations real soon. So, topic number 1, just briefly, an overview of our understanding now of how drugs affect all human brains, regardless of age. Many of you have probably been exposed to this science. I'm going to briefly overview it. It's helpful because when we talk about the teen brain, it's useful to have this as background. As you may know, drugs have a strong impact on our biology, and the nature of this impact is similar when you eat food and when you take drugs. This slide tries to show this in that the reward pathway region of the brain is implicated or involved when we are rewarded by eating food, and also the rewards that we get when we take drugs. But you'll notice there's a difference in the food portion of this slide versus the, get my pointer working here. There's not many yellow balls here, but there's a lot of yellow balls here, and that's reflecting the difference in the dopamine activation that occurs when there's a normal response to food versus the overreaction, the overexcitation that occurs when you take drugs like cocaine. So you get a very reasonable, normal reward response when you eat food, but you get this big wow effect when you take drugs, and thus its reinforcing properties are just quite extreme. This has a little science behind it now. Here we see the spike in dopamine levels, the main neurotransmitter of the reward pathway region that creates the psychological rewards. And you can see the big spike on amphetamine, and you can see taking food, you just get a little spike. The difference between a normal reaction and a wow effect. And this is another way of showing it. Here's a brain scan of someone on cocaine. So this is somebody being scanned while they're high on this drug. And the more yellow you see reflects the greater activation of the dopamine system. The person would be expressing greater euphoria as their brain has been lit up by cocaine. And you can see after about 20 minutes it abates. So we know this now. The brain is sensitive to drugs, and particularly the dopamine in our reward pathway region. Drugs, when they occur, the person takes them a lot, and the brain is exposed to drugs repeatedly. The dopamine system, though, gets deleteriously impacted. So it's not just that you get an immediate high, but unfortunately, with repeated exposure, there appears to be a compensatory reaction in the brain where the dopamine system then cools itself down. So less dopamine is produced in reaction to the fact that you're overheating the dopamine system. The brain is trying to correct for something that it's occurring outside of a normal range. That's why it doesn't occur when you just eat a regular amount of food. You're not creating this hijacking effect. But with drugs, the brain is trying to correct for what's essentially getting overheated in terms of this reaction of the dopamine. And this slide shows on the left the left column are 4 different brain scans of 4 different people that are not on drugs. And you can see inside the yellow, there's a fair amount of orange. And the orange is the dopamine activity occurring in these individuals' brains. To the right are 4 other different people. So now we've got a total of 8 brain scans here. Each of these people to the right are addicted to a particular drug. You can see by looking at the row. And what also do you notice? Inside the green, there is hardly any orange or red. And that's reflecting that these individuals are suffering from depleted dopamine. And that's going to create the funk feeling, not your normal self, and an obvious response to that is a person returns to the drug to at least get an immediate relief from the acute type of withdrawal that occurs. The good news is if you can get drug-free and stay drug-free, you can restore normal or near normal dopamine processing. Reflected in this slide, top row, a normal person not on drugs or not addicted, shows a lot of yellow. That would be a reflection of normal brain activity. The next 2 rows represent a cocaine addict who's being scanned 10 days after abstinence began and 100 days during abstinence. And you can see the person starting to return to some normal functioning. Drug-free state can go a long ways in bringing back brain repair. So keep some of those principles in mind. We'll return to them soon. Now I'm going to provide a brief overview of the very recent brain science related to adolescent brain development. For the time being, I'm just going to talk about normal brain development. Keep in mind that this science is very new. We don't know yet a lot about how different characteristics and features of a person, whether it's their background, gender, or experiences, life stress events, etc., how that impacts brain development. We're starting to do those studies now. So the main principles that have emerged come from healthy youngsters. There are two big principles from the science. I'll briefly summarize those and then get into some details. So the first big principle that was very interesting, I think, was that the finding that the brain significantly develops during the teenage years and isn't fully complete, if you will, in the science of neuroscience until about age 25. So that was a surprise. Prior to neuroimaging and doing the detailed work here, scientists thought that the brain was pretty much done developing by the beginning of adolescence. And then you had other biological things going on, hormonal activity, etc. But now we have to consider brain development as part of the picture of the biological changes going on during adolescence. Just a little sidebar, age 25 I think is an interesting age when we put that onto ages that in our country and in a lot of westernized countries are considered those that reflect age of majority or give people certain privileges. And so on this slide, it's I'm laying out what we have in America, and 16 is an important one, particularly with driving. 18, a lot of things kick in along with voting, and then the 21 is there for drinking. 21 in drinking, of course, was not in place all that far back. When I was growing up, it was 18, 19. In some states had 21, but with the public health data, the association, the strong association between drinking, driving, and being young showed that it made a lot of sense to move that drinking age, the minimum drinking age, up to 21. But 25 is the age at which the brain finishes developing, but we have a lot of an adolescent's privileges and access to things occur well before 25. Just one more thing about age and privileges. This is an ad that was put in the New York Times in 2007 by Allstate, and the ad reads, "Why do most 16-year-olds drive like they're missing a part of their brain?" And then below that it says, "Because they are." And you might see the hole in the brain is the shape of a Volkswagen Beetle. And this is an ad promoting the value of graduated driver licensing regulations. These regulations make a lot of sense. When you look at them, you'll see, I think, the kinds of parameters you want to put in place to help a teenager whose teen brain might have particular problems or be at risk for particular driving problems with certain situations and in a certain context. For example, driving without a lot of same-age friends in the car where a lot of chaos and distractions can occur, and a lot of these regulations help with that. More on the teen brain and context coming up. But let's get to the second principle, the second big finding from this brain development science, and this is reflected in this slide. the title, An Immature Brain Equals Less Brakes on the Go System. And so behind this title is the notion that the teen brain is developing in a certain way where some parts of the brain are maturing faster or developing more quickly than other parts. And the two general parts of the brain relevant here are what are metaphorically called the brakes, the part of the brain that helps you pause and reflect, engage in second thought, where you resist impulses and delay gratification. And these are regions in roughly the front part of the brain. They tend to mature slower or a little later in the teen years, as opposed to what are metaphorically called the accelerator or the go system of the brain, near the back or middle of the brain. And these are the emotional and motivation regions of the brain. They tend to develop faster. So there's this imbalance. And this imbalance might have implications for how we understand teenagers. By the way, this picture I have here is of a kind of a souped up, very adolescent friendly, I think, bungee jump at a local state fair. You could pay a little extra money. You could go up a higher on the bungee jump ladder, and you'd get a bike, and then you get to take this bike and ride it down a ramp, and then right about here, the photo is taken at the point where you let the bike go, and that drops down, but you are sort of flying out, not just dropping straight down. Had a lot of extra excitement to it, I think, than a typical bungee jump. Very popular with the teenagers. So a little detail behind these two principles. Several brain processes are complete either before or during adolescence, but there are two main processes that are still occurring during the teen years, and one of them is called myelination. That's this pink line here. You can see that still continues maturation even past adolescence. And then the other big one is called synaptic refinement that's represented here, the brown hump. And you can see that that has also a significant development period during adolescence. It's these two processes that contribute to this imbalanced maturation going on in the main regions of the brain. This is a time-lapse view of it. You can see as things are getting blue here, the pruning is occurring. And right here, roughly in this front part that's getting blue relatively last, that's the main region for the brakes of the brain, or the prefrontal cortex. And that's associated with judgment. And so that development occurs a little later. And what occurs a little earlier are things related to motor coordination, emotion, and motivation. So the front of the brain, or the seat of sober second thought, tends to mature a little slower. Parts of the brain that are very sensitive to motivation, emotion, that enjoy sensation, excitement, risk-taking, etc., they tend to mature a little faster. So given this imbalance, you might then predict how the organism will behave. And this slide here represents developmental psychologists that have weighed in and commented on, well, how might we understand adolescent behavior in light of brain development? So putting aside psychosocial factors and other biological factors, those, of course, will contribute to adolescent behavior. But if we look at the way the brain is developing in certain regions that are perhaps dominating over other regions, how might we understand adolescent behavior? So I have 8 principles up here, and some of them reflect that the teen years is a time when there's perhaps a greater preference for certain choices or certain types of activities, such as physical activity and activity with high excitement and that are very rewarding, or activity that poses novelty to the teenager. All of us like perhaps high excitement and novelty, etc., but the notion is that during the teen years there might be a greater preference, a greater seeking of it, as opposed to other options. And then 5 and 6, I note um, this is a time when the teenager is not at its best in controlling emotions or in considering negative consequences. So the positive consequences are perhaps more salient than the negative to the teenager. And then 7 and 8 continue on and just reflect that this might also be a time when there's a greater tendency to be very attentive to social information, which is an important source of rewards for the teenager, um, and part of the peer influence pattern, and also a time where there might be more risk taking and more display of impulsiveness. So in this slide, I have colored 2 through 8 with red, and these um, particular features or characteristics that might occur to, or partially at least, resulting from brain development, also struck me as risk factors for curiosity to use drugs and perhaps may even contribute to continuing to use even in the face of negative consequences. Um, because drug use can have an excitement, appear, novelty feature to it. It one's emotions might drive someone to use drugs. You surely you're not necessarily going to be thinking of the negative consequences. Might be part of one's social life, important to their social interactions, and it could tap into a teenager's tendency to take risks. Something about risk taking, though, I want to briefly mention, important sidebar. Not all risk taking is bad. We should perhaps think of it as a trait that's part um, of our genetic makeup. It may have important survival value and adaptive value to it. Also, it's um, getting clearer that risk taking during the teen years is not um, just simply an issue of the teenager's emotions getting the best of them, or that they somehow have a cognitive or a thinking deficit about the nature of risk taking. Heavily influenced by context. The situation the person is in can have a great impact on to the extent to which a person is going to take risk or not. Of course, somebody's natural risk-takingness might also have an influence, but context can also weigh in quite heavily. Here's an example. This comes from a controlled laboratory study of looking at driving behavior. You can study driving behavior in simulated driving labs. And this study compared 3 age groups, adolescents, young adults, and adults. And they measured percent of risky decisions and number of crashes while engaged in these simulated driving tasks. So they had the 3 age groups. Well, they had 2 conditions. One condition was where the person was just by themselves in the simulated car going through the exercises. And that's the data in the blue bars. And you can see the 3 age groups were equivalent when it came to percent of risky decisions made and number of simulated crashes. There's not an age difference. But where does the age difference show up? When the second condition kicked in and they then went through the task, but this time they were allowed to have a friend sit next to them in the simulated car. And there you got a group difference, and the difference is perhaps in the predictable direction. That's when the youngest age group, the adolescents, showed a significant change in their driving behavior in the worst direction. The other age groups were able to handle the peer effect without it creating worse driving pattern. Context has a role in human behavior, and it might even have a stronger role among teenagers. So to tie up this section, I want to remind you that this does not mean that teenagers, while their brain is developing, have compromised intelligence. It does not mean they have low brain power. This is more about um, brain development impacting judgment. Um, but teenagers vary on this, and it doesn't mean they can't exert judgment. But there's certain conditions probably where judgment might be compromised, and for some teenagers, they might be also at the as an outlier in terms of their risk takingness, and thus may show a greater tendency of poor judgment. But teenagers are not absent of judgment just because um, their brain is developing. It's just a period of one's life where there perhaps are tendencies of making judgments in certain ways, and they might be under the greater influence of context, more so than when you're an adult. So we've tackled two neuroscience topics, and now I want to intersect the two and talk about the developing brain and addiction with a focus on alcohol. Why alcohol? Well, there's more data at this point on alcohol. It's a drug that's a little easier to study in the laboratory, um, and so there's just more empirical basis for us to look at this topic. Is the developing brain more at risk for a substance? So we're going to be focusing on, is it more at risk for alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence? I do have a little sidebar on marijuana that I'll bring up momentarily. But the main question um, I'm going to address was wonderfully articulated by Linda Spear. And the question is this: are adolescents more susceptible than adults to the effects of alcohol? And there's 4 lines of evidence I'm going to review. Some of the data are from human studies and some from animal studies. All of the data are indirect. You have to keep in mind you can't do rigorous controlled studies to look at a complex question like this. So we have to be careful and not over concluding. That's why many of the slides I have the warning symbol to remind us that not to overinterpret the data. Animal studies are important because they do allow us to control some things we can't with humans, and we can give alcohol to an adolescent animal, such as a rat, where we wouldn't be able to ethically do that to adolescent humans. Now, why rats? Well, they're an interesting animal. They have a brain that's structured roughly equivalent as the human brain. The adolescent rat brain development is analogous to development of the human adolescent brain. And also, adolescent rats and adult rats, when they get drunk, they show generally predictable behavior, behavior that mimics what happens when adults get drunk. So they've been appealing to use in animal studies. But with animal data, keep in mind that these animal models have to be interpreted cautiously because it's animal data, it's not human data, and you cannot mimic everything you'd like to um, in the delivery or the study of the effects of alcohol with animals. For example, you have to really inject the rat with ethanol because they don't readily want to drink it. And so there's the stress and the whole impact of getting an injection, and that might have a downstream impact on the behavior you're observing, above and beyond just the effects of alcohol. And I'm going to be talking in a narrow range and not discussing the possible role of hormonal changes with respect to adolescent risk, but hormones surely could have an impact on behavior and also on drug sensitivity and the impact on how drug problems emerge. So that is an important topic, the role of hormones, but that won't be talked about today. So 4 lines of evidence. The first one is survey data. So how can we, with human data, look and see if there is any support for the notion that youth is a particularly vulnerable period? Well, a lot of survey data includes young people and adults, and so we could compare data points and see if there's anything that's enlightening along these lines. And um, the overwhelming body of survey or epidemiological data suggests that um, drug use, as well as the emergence of drug problems, peaks during the youth years. And this has been a pattern that's quite consistent across many generations. I'll show you a couple slides to reflect it. This is one that indicates the prevalence of recent or past year DSM-4 defined alcohol dependence based on age group. And the first bar, which is the highest, which is at 12.2%, is age group of 15 to 20. And as you see the age groups getting older, you see that the bars are smaller or shorter. The prevalence rate, at least recent occurrence of alcohol dependence, drops as a function of age. So as we get older, we tend to have less of us experiencing an alcohol problem. If you look at the other substances, you get a similar pattern as well. So based on this picture of things, you see youth being a particularly vulnerable period. Another way of looking at it is the extent to which when you started to use drugs, when you onsetted your use of alcohol, how that impacted your probability of having a problem. So this was based on adult data, and they interviewed individuals and first looked at who was a current user of alcohol and who met criteria for an alcohol use disorder or not, and then also asked everyone if they've ever used alcohol, when did you start using? So the data that intersects onset of use and probability of having an adult problem is shown here. And the way you read this chart is the following. So the first bar has a 16 above it, and below it it says less than 12 years. So for those in the survey that said, I started using alcohol at age 12 or younger, 16% of them had a current problem. And then you can see how the current problem rate drops as a function of waiting longer or later to start using. And you can see all the way over to the far right that the fewest problems were among those that waited the longest to start using. So that would also suggest from this pattern of data that youth is a vulnerable period. So let me go to second line of evidence. This is using rat studies, and when rats get drunk, they do show similar effects. They show sensitivity to alcohol based on sedation and motor impairment. And so with these kind of studies, you get adolescent rats drunk, you get adult rats drunk, and then you compare their behavior in terms of acute effects. And two of those major effects are these, sedation and motor impairment. And what was found is that the adolescent rat showed less acute effects of alcohol. One way it was studied is the water maze test. You put a rat in a water container. They're motivated to find the platform because they don't like the water. They don't like spending time swimming. And you can measure how fast they swim, how quickly they found the platform, a basic measure of motor coordination. And it turns out the adolescent rat did better than the adult rat. So other studies that looked at sedation effects and other effects also come to the same conclusion that the adolescent rat can drink more or get more drunk, if you will, before they show acute effects compared to the adult. So they note this as less sensitivity to acute effects. So if you're not sensitive to the acute effects, that might embolden you to keep on drinking because you don't think you're drunk. And so you keep on drinking, even though you are not drinking at a safe level. Here's some survey data that might reflect this. Comparing two data points here. percent that said they had 5 or more drinks in a row in the past 2 weeks, and percent that said they were drunk in the past month. This is from national data called Monitoring the Future. And in the 8th graders, you can see there was a higher percent that said they drank 5 or more than said they were drunk. The other two age groups, it's roughly equivalent. So this pattern would suggest there's a group of 8th graders that weren't very sensitive to the effects of drugs. They drank a lot, but they didn't think they were drunk. Perhaps this less sensitivity shows up in the 8th graders there. Another set of studies shows the social impact of alcohol. As for all of us, or at least for most of us, there's a social disinhibitory effect of alcohol, and we get more socially confident. You can show this with rats. They play fight more. They hang out or hover in groups when they're intoxicated as compared to when they're not. And when you compare the two age groups, the adolescent rat showed more of this effect. So the data there suggests that the adolescent rat is more sensitive to the social disinhibitory effects of alcohol. So if we were to look at lines of evidence 2 and 3, you have one line of evidence that says adolescents are less sensitive to the negative effects of alcohol, and you have another line of evidence suggesting the adolescent rat is more sensitive to the positive effects. Sounds like a formula for alcohol being a very rewarding experience. And so if we generalize the rat data to humans, we might come to the conclusion that adolescence is a time where drinking is very rewarding. As an adult, it has its rewards, but might not be so salient. The last line of evidence talks about the potential for early alcohol use producing cognitive effects, and the data are in the direction of negative cognitive effects. With the rat literature, when you compare adolescent rats to adult rats after they've been exposed to a lot of alcohol, you see greater deficits in memory and in activity of the brain region called the hippocampus in adolescents compared to adults. So you get memory impairment and hippocampus deficits in both age groups, but you get a greater deficit in the adolescent rats, suggesting the adolescent brain is vulnerable to the effects of alcohol. Human data are correlational and so still very preliminary, but the data are suggestive in unfortunately the wrong direction. One set of studies looked at the differences in memory performance in two groups. There's the alcohol dependence group, that's the data in orange, and the comparison teenage group in yellow, a group that didn't have history of alcohol abuse, and you can see the higher memory scores in the group without the alcohol exposure. Correlational, so we can't assume causality with this. Perhaps the alcohol-dependent group had a poor memory to begin with. This is looking at hippocampus size in two groups. Another a different set of subjects, but also organized according to whether they have a history of alcohol dependence versus healthy controls. This is the alcohol dependence group, and this is the scatter plot of their size of the hippocampus. That's the memory region of the brain, and the higher up a dot, the larger the hippocampus. So you can see on average, you've got clustering of the alcohol disorder group. Their hippocampus size is in this area. In the normal non-alcohol group, there's greater variability and definitely greater proportion of youngsters that have the higher, I should say, the larger volume. When you did a mean difference test, there's about a 10% smaller volume in the alcohol disorder group compared to the healthy controls. I'm going to skip these slides because it just basically says the same thing. Alcohol may have an impact on learning. That was with brain scan data. I want to just do a quick sidebar on IQ and cannabis. interesting study from New Zealand that used longitudinal data. So that's stronger data than the correlational data I've shown you, that was able to track IQ from youth to adulthood and also look to see if IQ change had any relationship to the person's use of cannabis. Um, so there's a lot of bars here. 3 sets. The sets are broken down by whether the sample had one diagnosis of cannabis dependence as an adult, two diagnoses of cannabis dependence as an adult, or three diagnoses of cannabis dependence as an adult. Everyone was assessed multiple times from childhood through adult. So there was an opportunity for people to meet cannabis dependence criteria more than once. And then you see there's dark bars and gray bars. So the dark bars represent those people in the survey that said they used cannabis for the first time in their life at age 18 or younger. And the gray bars represent those that said they waited till after 18 to use cannabis for the first time. So you notice two big patterns. For those that had the most diagnoses of cannabis dependence or the most chronic use of the drug throughout their life, they had the biggest bars. These bars are below the line. They're dropping down, and that reflects change in IQ in the negative direction. That is IQ from roughly childhood, 10 or roughly 10 or 11 years of age, compared to late 30s, and these reflect a significant or large drop in IQ. Less drop for those that had less chronic use. The other thing you notice is the dark bars are longer than the gray bars, which would indicate the earlier onset folks consistently showed more IQ loss compared to those that waited till after 18. So youth as a vulnerable time once again shows up with another data set. Different drug, and this is longitudinal data, but that principle seems to be quite resilient today. I just want to go to this bar. This was the most provocative data. So for individuals that said they'd started to use marijuana at age 18 or younger, and they were chronic users, had met cannabis dependence criteria at least 3 times during the span of the teen years to late 30s, at least 3 times, could be more. On average, they had a significant IQ drop, and this bar represents 8 IQ points. So it's about a half a standard deviation, since IQ tests have 15 for points for standard deviation. So about a half a standard deviation loss. Youth is relevant to this as well as chronicity. So let me summarize, and then there's some time for questions and discussion. So hopefully you appreciated the basic principle that adolescence is a time of significant brain development. It's characterized by many features that perhaps frustrate us when we're parenting them or dealing with them in the classroom or in a treatment program, but these features are normal. The conflict with adults, resisting authority, showing irritability, perhaps extra risk-taking, all these things are part of normal adolescence. And I've made a case that brain science may help us understand the nature of some of these behavioral changes. It might be more than just hormones and more than just cultural and social forces. And then I talked about several lines of evidence suggesting that youth is a vulnerable period. These are studies and data sets that are far from ideal and far from perfect. So the jury is still out on this. I think if you looked at all 4 lines of evidence, you would see a trend towards supporting the notion that adolescence is a vulnerable period. Not only as a time to be curious about drug use, but as a time that um, where the negative consequences are not considered, and the unfortunately the teen brain might be vulnerable if an individual continues to use, and that vulnerability might lead to learning and cognitive impacts. So, why is youth this vulnerable period? Um, well, I, I implied it by talking about how the way the brain develops that might lead to a time in one's life where there's certain biases and tendencies in decision making, and those tendencies might also really, as an aggregate, create risk towards drug use. There's also neuroscience behind it. The developing brain also might have a very sensitive dopamine system, more sensitive than is the case when you're an adult. So you remember how drugs can hijack the brain. You get this immediate reward, this big wow effect, and if you keep insulting the brain with drugs, there's this dopamine depletion problem that occurs, and when you have that, then you get these acute withdrawal symptoms, and you get urges to keep using. So this nasty cycle that occurs from a wow effect to dopamine hijacking, this process may occur more rapidly, more quickly with the sensitive dopamine system of a developing brain as opposed to an adult brain. This is uh, something that's getting studied. There also might be an early exposure problem. So by exposing the brain to drugs early on, that may alter structure and process, and to the point that um, that may contribute to excessive drug use. A rat study showed this with nicotine. Rats that were exposed to nicotine during adolescence self-administered nicotine quite heavily later as an adult, as opposed to rats that didn't get the adolescent exposure. So the pre-exposure might have primed the brain and perhaps behavioral traits that contributed to a higher use of nicotine later on. So I see we're nearing conclusion, and I just wanted to go right to um, two slides. One is trying to impress upon you that when possible in your prevention and treatment programs, include these two neuroscience themes. The one about the importance of understanding that the brain can get hijacked by drugs, and it's important to not just assume someone can turn on and off the interest in using drugs. Unfortunately, addiction has a strong neurobiological component that always, or that may not always be under our self-control. And then I think it's important to talk to teenagers that developing brain may even be more susceptible to the effects of drugs. Um, and that's why it's so important to be drug-free during the teen years and at least wait until you're of legal age to try alcohol and to stay away from the illicit ones. May have not only an impact on future risk for dependence, but it also may have an impact on one's learning. If you're interested in bringing this topic into the classroom, there's two resources I've listed on this slide. One is from an excellent group called BSCS. Go to their website. You can see what's available with this product called Drug Abuse, Addiction, and the Adolescent Brain. And then Hazelden has come out with a DVD multimedia resource, 8 lessons. It's called Drugs in the Developing Brain. You can go to their website. Both of them are intended to help science teachers bring this knowledge into the science classroom, and both of them have excellent, engaging exercises and components to it. And they both come with handbooks, so you don't have to be an expert in neuroscience to deliver the content. I'm a big fan of helping parents, and I point parents to two websites. One of them is called Prevention Smart Parents from the Mentor Foundation. Several units here that walk parents through important developmental issues, including the importance of Raising a Drug-Free Child. And then there's an excellent one from the partnership. Their new website is drugfree.org. And you can see several resources there to help parents. Okay, I'm going to leave this suggested reading list up, and if there's some time for questions and discussion, we could do that now.
Great, thanks so much, Ken. And if you have a question and you would like to offer it up for discussion and for Dr. Winters to respond to, please type that into the Q&A pod at this time, and we will respond to those as they come in. And if you haven't already, those of you who are joining us online, please participate in the 2 poll questions, and we'll be broadcasting those results and discussing those a little bit here, in the next few minutes.
I'll just comment on the second poll question. Adolescent marijuana use will increase within states that allow legalization or medicalization for 21 years and older, and 80% or so agree with that. That, as you may know, that's what's happening in a lot of states. If they go medical or legalization, they usually draw the line at 21. And so, of course, the question is, will that unfortunately lead to increased use of those underage? And so I know a lot of experts think that is the case. It will lead to that. And several states are collecting data to see if that is verified or not. It did happen, or it does happen with other drugs. So I think if it didn't happen with marijuana, I'd be quite surprised. But we'll have to see. It's all part of this interesting intersection of politics, public health, and adolescence.
Great. If you're ready to take questions, then Ken, I'll just read this first one that we
Very
have.
good.
The first question is there any relevant information regarding first American kids in particular?
The the most salient data that I'm aware of is that in generally speaking, Native American youth are at higher risk for alcohol and other drug use than non-Native American youth. But there are so many cultural and psychosocial issues that can account for that. So I surely don't think it's necessarily just a neuroscience reason. But the good news is prevention works, and when whether it's tribal communities or local communities or families apply rigorous and consistent principles that build assets and decrease or work towards reducing those risk factors, you can go a long way in improving the health of a youngster or in improving the likelihood that youngster will not use. I think that's something to reiterate. I surely gave you a neuroscience perspective on things, but biology does not, or genetics for that matter, does not dictate behavior. Behavior is under the influence of many other features and aspects and phenomenon, and we have an opportunity to influence those phenomenon to direct teenagers towards healthy decisions and healthy outcomes by virtue of our programs, by virtue of what we do in our communities and in our homes.
All right. Right, then let's take the next question from Charlene. Any evidence that use/dependence extends the adolescent phase beyond age 25?
Yeah, that's a great point because a lot of people observe perhaps that someone with an early drug use doesn't seem to be at the maturity level that their adult age would suggest. And I know that it's an interesting point. Is there some um, halting of the natural brain process if you use drugs too much in youth, and does that show up in one's behavior? Um, do we see more immature, 30-year-olds because of their prior drug use than 30-year-olds who didn't use during their youth? It's quite possible. That one hasn't been nailed down yet because we just haven't done those kind of studies. Um, I just remind teenagers and parents, it's um, take advantage of the wonderful restoration and recovery um, phenomenon of the human brain. So um, do what you can to get clean, to be healthy to your brain, and let those natural processes optimize their ability to help somebody recover.
Great. All right, and then we have another question from Jean. What is a good resource for conducting adolescent groups regarding marijuana?
Um, the question is, what's a good resource to educate? Um,
Um, the question is for conducting adolescent groups regarding marijuana.
okay. Well, I think those two classroom resources I mentioned can be used also in any kind of group, whether it's a therapy group, prevention class, health class, etc. Because they, weave in science, drug use, and adolescent decision making and health. Now, there's also a great book I think adults in our field should read about marijuana. It's written by Kevin Sabat, Sabet, and my apologies, I don't have the name of the book right at the tip of my tongue. If you Google Kevin Sabat's book on marijuana, it's excellent, easy read, and it's outlines out, outlines the all the myths about marijuana and um, how the public is misperceiving um, the lure that marijuana is bona fide medicine. These these arguments that he's trying to impose and teach adults are great to have in your back pocket when you're talking to teenagers who are throwing out, "Hey, you can't overdose from marijuana. Um, Marijuana doesn't make you violent. Marijuana, you can't get dependent from marijuana. You can't get addicted to marijuana. If we make it legal, there won't be the criminal element or the cartel out there." All these arguments that get thrown up by kids, all of them have good answers. And all of those are myths, except for the one that you probably can't overdose from marijuana, but you can have many other, of course, deleterious effects. Um, because I know that's what's happening with us. We get pretty good pushback from teenagers, and they've been reading the internet. They've been, of course, emboldened by many states that are going pro marijuana, and but most of the arguments are false, or they're misled, or they're misinformed, and there are good responses to them.
Great. We have another question. Do you have any suggestions for evidence-based model programs to use in prevention with adolescents?
Yes, there's a lot of good ones. Um, just as a general principle, I like the ones that um, have a lot of content and curriculum that are to help teenagers with skills and skills related to decision making and how to deal with peer pressure, how to steer their free time towards healthy things. And so a lot of programs do that. In other words, not just educating teenager about the dangers of drugs. I don't think that's enough. So um, I could give you a list of good ones, but I think what I'm going to recommend are two things. One is um, go to a good resource called NREP um, dot samhsa.gov. So it's NREPP dot SAMHSA.gov. Or if you just Google NREP, NREPP, you'll get there. It's the National Registry for Evidence-Based Programs and Practices. And then when you're in that system, put in the keyword window prevention, and you could put in school prevention or community prevention or home-based prevention, and that'll then pop up the programs that NREP has reviewed and um, judged to be very solid scientific-based, evidence-based programs. So it's a good way to start because you're getting at least a kind of an independent perspective on what looks to be strong programs. Then the second part would be feel free to email me with something that looks promising from your little window shopping in NREP, and I can tell you more about what I know of those programs or program.
And a couple of people responded with that. So I passed on that note that someone mentioned the name of the book was Reefer Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana by Kevin Sabat. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but thank you for passing that on.
There you go. Yep, that's it. That's the one.
Great. And
Somebody's
then um, we've got a few more questions. One from Anne Marie is, based on this information, do you believe that youths with ADHD who take, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, but who take Adderall medication to help
Adderall.
with the focus or concentration ability of the youth, this might also contribute to possible misuse of drugs, alcohol, or the opposite effect?
So there's a fair amount of controversy about that. I I think the data suggest strongly that good management of ADHD medication, whether it's Adderall or Ritalin or Strattera, etc., reduces or does not negatively alter somebody's risk towards future drug use. This has been studied a lot with longitudinal data, and I think the data overwhelmingly point to the good news. The good news is medicine for someone with ADHD helps them with that disorder, and that helps them negotiate life and makes it easier for them in school and to socialize and to deal with attention issues. And that, of course, provides more assets and less risk for the teenager and downstream contributes to lower risk for drug use. But it is controversial, and I did want to remind everyone the notion is, though, that someone has to be well managed on the medication, so not over medicated or under medicated, because you got to get the right match between which psychostimulant or ADHD medication works for which particular ADHD child. Ritalin is still considered, I think, the most efficacious for most youngsters with ADHD, but others will respond to different medications, whether it's Strattera, Adderall, etc. Um, I know many of these meds are overprescribed, and that is a problem. It can be easy for perhaps parents and a physician to just assume someone has ADHD, so I'll give medicine for it when they might not have ADHD. But um, if anyone's interested, um, I recommend you Google Willens, Wilens. Timothy is his first name, but if you Google Willens and ADHD, so Wilens and ADHD, you will see the things he has written, these meta-analyses, these significant summary reports that address this topic.
Wonderful. We have another question here from Josette. You alluded to the biopsychosocial context of addiction issues. How do we intervene with families with cycles of addiction where grandparents and parents have addiction issues?
Good. For some of us, that is alerting or educating the family members that if there is family history, that might mean there's genetic or biological risk, and that risk could be passed on to the children, and thus those children could be at elevated risk. So just having some parents and families just need to be aware that that history or cycle, the generational level, can still have, unfortunately, an influence, a negative influence on future generations. And then having people's attitudes and behaviors reflect drug-free lifestyles. And that's easy to say that. I know that means perhaps some people making some major changes in their life, but it's the importance of not just one's behavior in the home or in their community related to drug use, but also the attitudes that they have. And these, modeling good behavior and expressing these important drug-free attitudes in the family and early in life, and continuing those good habits as the youngster grows up are very important. None of these, of course, are guarantees. But I always tell parents, if you believe you have a strong family history of addiction or alcoholism, you need to take more seriously the issue of trying to raise a drug-free child than parents that don't have the big family history. Everyone should take it seriously, but for those that have the family history, it's a much more important topic, and I think they have to do more heavy lifting when it comes to trying to set in motion all the important things to raise a drug-free child.
Okay, great. Dr. Winters, we have a couple of questions that allude to the comparative addictive nature of marijuana versus alcohol or other substances, as well as changes in the nature with which marijuana is treated in the media, particularly in states where it is now legalized. So could you comment on where those conflicting messages might come into play when still trying to make the clinical prevention and a part of our work?
Sure. So these are interesting debates. I think I get frustrated when I hear of the how people are perceiving marijuana that are not scientists, or they're not educated in addiction. So there is a strong push towards pro-marijuana attitudes and obviously laws that are coming from the political arena. And I think that is it's a largely misinformed direction that's pulling America this way. I think there's two things working against us that want America to be smarter about marijuana. One of them is the evidence that is true that marijuana can have medical value, and the other is the way people get addicted to marijuana, or the impact it has on people, is different to some degree than with other drugs. So there is medical value of marijuana. It's, however, delivering it by somebody smoking when there's several hundred other agents that you're taking in that have nothing to do with the medical value, of course, is not very logical. So when scientists can get and extract what are the active medical ingredients in a marijuana plant, and then be able to deliver that to people without having to smoke it, and deliver it so that it's efficacious, so that it has enough potency to it, then I think we'll be smart about the role of marijuana in medicine. But this is a very crude approach to thinking that there's some medical value in a product that is uncontrolled and has a lot more non-medical features to it than medical. But that gets glossed over in the debate, at least the political debate. The other issue is the debate about the addictive potential of marijuana. In drugs, all drugs of abuse vary in their addiction potential. Some of them, the addiction occurs quicker than others. Some of them have more prominent features of the dependence or addiction spectrum than other drugs. So there's variability: nicotine, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, etc. So marijuana does reveal the same 11 core symptoms of a substance use disorder as all the other drugs, even the physical ones. That's a myth that you can't show tolerance or that you can't go through withdrawal. That's a myth. It does probably occur more slowly or not as acutely compared to some of the other drugs, such as methamphetamine or cocaine. You know, some of the speed-like drugs that really can lead to quick onset of symptoms. So that might give false belief that it's a safer drug because it just takes longer before you show dependence. I don't think that really is a good feature to hang its safer value on. The other thing is people don't tend to show extreme aggressive or acting out behavior, except for a small little sidebar or exception I'll mention in a moment, with marijuana. So it does tend to slow people down and put you in a calmer mood, where many of the other drugs hype you up, and that leads to more social problems. That, I admit, that's true. So that might give people a false sense that it's safer. But marijuana is being linked to psychosis risk, and that is lost in the debate. And there's more rigorous evidence of linking early marijuana use to contributing to onset and course of psychosis than there is for, I think, the impact of marijuana on IQ, which is kind of early emerging data. But there's been a link between marijuana and psychosis in the literature for decades. This gets lost in the debate, unfortunately.
Okay, well, looks like we'll just take a couple more questions before we finish up here. One on will cigarettes or nicotine have the same impact on brain development?
So nicotine hijacks the brain like the other drugs. It impacts dopamine like the other drugs. And but you can also recover from it like the other drugs. That one is a quick onset addiction, in part because you smoke it. So inhalation's a great efficient way to get a drug delivered to the brain and to work on your reward pathway system. And we have a lot of nicotine receptors in our brain. So a lot of our brain is lighting up when we smoke and deliver nicotine to it. So, and that's why it's easy to get addicted to nicotine, and it's hard to stop smoking. And the youth data is also similar. So you know, early onset, greater risk probability. Same with the other drugs.
All right. From Nicole,
By the way,
you
just
discussed.
I'll
I'm
just,
sorry.
since we've been talking about marijuana and someone brought up the good cigarette question, you might know this, the latest national data on drug use among youth showed that more teenagers in the last year started using marijuana for the first time than started using tobacco products for the first time. So youth are getting a little smarter on the tobacco risk, but we're not winning much with the marijuana story.
All right. This question is from Nicole. You discussed improved performance among adolescents on alcohol. Is there a similar response with marijuana use?
I don't know of one. That's a, there is the myth that your people are more creative and think better and deeper about things on marijuana. No hard evidence of it. A lot of great anecdotes, a lot of great stories, right? So about this, but no hard evidence that is true.
All right. One from Sandra. How does one dispel the secondary high?
Ooh, I'm not sure what secondary high. When I'll maybe you're reflecting on this that um, people reflect on their use of drugs and how it can help them relax, help them with their anxiety or attention issues, or help them with their boredom. And it is, the functional value of drugs is strong. People use for in many ways logical reasons. Um, the key to uh, getting a person to stop using is to have them understand that functional link and recognize they've got to come up with a saner solution to their issues, their problems, because drug use is just very temporary and it's got all these other negative risks associated with it. Um, to me, that's a key in the counseling arena and prevention programs. When they can tackle that, I think that's a value as well. Not sure I answered your question, Deanna, but send me an email if I missed the boat there.
Oh, that question was from Sandra, but I'll
Sandra,
put the
there you go.
question from Deanna up now. Are there any studies on youth who are on the spectrum, either full-blown autism or Asperger's, but are socially inept, who begin using to fit in?
I don't know of anyone that's studied that exactly. That's a great question. Um, you know, it, but, using drugs because you want to fit in, we know that's a big phenomenon, big risk pathway out there. Fitting in with friends or just fitting in with a peer group or fearing that you'll get ostracized or kicked out of a peer group because you're not following the crowd. All those are part of can be part of the teen existence, whether you have a social issue or not.
All right. Um, well, it looks like that takes care of all of our questions. Thank you so much for your participation and for participating in the poll questions as well. You can see those results if you're joining us online, so please take um, a moment and check that out as well. And then we will just get through our final concluding points here, and I just want to thank everyone too for your patience as we had a couple of little technical things over the course of the presentation, but thank you for sticking with us and for your patience. We also ask that you please stay online as we close out the webinar so you can be redirected to our survey. If the survey doesn't automatically pop up, you may copy and paste the URL on the closing webinar screen to access the survey. Also, watch your email inbox for our follow-up, which will include a link to the recording of this webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for the next webinar in this series, Referral Service Coordination and Documentation, with presenter D. LeBeau-Hein on Wednesday, February 19th. We hope you will also be able to join us for our next webinar in our American Indian and Alaska Native Behavioral Health webinar series on February 5th, when Dr. Spiro Manson will present on Bridging the Gaps in Culture and Geography, Telehealth with American Indian Communities. Thank you for your time participating in the session today. We hope you have enjoyed the presentation and look forward to hearing your feedback.